Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is about Fanny Kelly, captured at 19 on the Oregon Trail and held for 5 months. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight we are going to follow a woman whose name almost nobody knows, whose story almost nobody has heard, and whose courage and intelligence and sheer refusal to be broken by what happened to her places her among the most remarkable human beings the American frontier produced. She was 19 years old when her story truly began. She was traveling west on the Oregon Trail with her husband and a small wagon party and a 7-year-old girl she had informally adopted for the journey. A child named Mary, an orphan whom Fanny had taken in because the child needed someone. And Fanny was someone who responded to need. In July of 1864, on a stretch of the trail in what is now Wyoming, the wagon train was attacked. Everything changed in minutes. Everything that came before that moment was preparation for what came after, though Fanny Kelly could not have known that when she woke up that morning in her wagon, probably thinking about the road ahead and the heat, and whether Mary had eaten enough breakfast. She was taken captive by the Oglala Sioux. She was held for 5 months. And in those 5 months, she did something that no one who knew only the surface of her situation would have predicted. She thought and observed and remembered and acted, not as a passive victim of an extraordinary experience, but as an active intelligence moving through it, trying to understand it, trying to survive it with her mind intact and herself intact and the people around her as protected as she could manage to make them. She wrote it all down afterward. Her book, Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians, was published in 1871 and became a bestseller, and it is still in print, and it is one of the great American frontier memoirs. But the book is not the whole of her story. The whole of her story is larger and stranger and more remarkable than a single book can hold. This is her story, all of it. Let us go to her now. Frances Wiggins was born on May 18, 1845, in Otonabee, Ontario, Canada, a small farming community east of Peterborough in what was then called Canada West, a landscape of mixed forest and cleared farmland, of cold winters and brief, brilliant summers, of the particular orderliness that characterized the British colonial settlements of Upper Canada in the mid-19th century. Her family was of Ulster Protestant stock, the kind of family that kept its accounts carefully and its emotions more carefully still, that valued education and industry and the kind of quiet personal courage that does not announce itself. She was educated well by the standards available to girls of her class and place. She could read and write fluently, had some knowledge of literature and history, possessed the practical domestic skills that 19th century women's education emphasized, and had the particular quality of mind that wide reading in childhood tends to produce. A habit of framing experience in narrative, of reaching for language to describe what she was living through, of understanding that the stories we tell about events shape what those events mean. This quality, the instinct to narrate, to reach, for words to make meaning through language, would serve her in ways she could not have imagined when she was a girl reading by candlelight in Otonabee. It would be the thing that saved her, in the specific sense of saving, not her body, which required different tools, but herself, the interior person who needed to make sense of what was happening in order to remain coherent inside it. She was 19 years old when she married Josiah Kelly in 1863. He was a farmer and sometime trader, a man of practical ambitions who had caught the Western fever that was pulling hundreds of thousands of Americans and Canadian immigrants toward the territories in the years after the California gold rush had demonstrated what the West contained. He had heard about Idaho. He had heard about the opportunities for men willing to work hard in a place where the land was still cheap and the future was still open. He wanted to go. Fanny was not reluctant. She was 19, newly married, possessed of the young person's capacity for imagining the future as purely positive, all opportunity, no obstacle. And the West that Josiah described sounded like the beginning of something rather than the end of anything. She said yes. They began to prepare. The wagon train they joined in the spring of 1864 assembled in Geneva, Kansas, a small party by the standards of the peak emigration years, perhaps a dozen people in several wagons. There was Josiah's brother and his family. There was a man named Franklin, and others whose names appear in Fanny's later account with varying degrees of specificity. And there was Mary Hurley. Mary Hurley was 7 years old and an orphan. The exact circumstances by which she came to be traveling with the Kelly party are not entirely clear from the historical record. Fanny's account describes her as a child who had been left without family and who needed someone to care for her, and describes Fanny's decision to take responsibility for her with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone who has encountered a need and responded to it without extensive deliberation. She was a child without a family. Fanny had room in her wagon and enough love to make room in her life. Mary joined them. This decision, to take in a 7-year-old child on the eve of a 2,000-mile overland journey, without the authority of formal adoption, out of simple human response to a child's vulnerability, tells you more about Fanny Kelly than any other single fact in her biography. She was 19 years old, she was newly married, she was about to cross the American continent, and she stopped for a child who needed stopping for. The wagon train left Kansas in May 1864 and headed northwest on the Oregon Trail, following the route that hundreds of thousands of emigrants had traveled before them. The early weeks of the journey were the journey as it was supposed to be. The wide blue sky of the plains, the grass still green from the spring rains, the steady rhythm of the oxen and the creak of the wagon, and the particular smell of the trail in the morning when the dew was still on the grass and the day had not yet heated to its afternoon ferocity. Fanny watched everything. She noted the landscape, the way the plains changed as they moved west, the grass shortening and the sky widening, the first distant blue suggestions of mountains appearing on the horizon days before they were close enough to see clearly. She noted the people on the trail with them and around them, the other wagon trains, the stories that came back from people heading east about conditions ahead. She was paying attention with the thoroughness of someone who knows, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that paying attention is going to matter. The attack came on the afternoon of July 12, 1864, on the Little Box Elder Creek in what is now Converse County, Wyoming, roughly 200 miles east of Fort Laramie. The wagon train had stopped to rest during the heat of the afternoon, a common practice on the trail, where the midday heat was brutal enough to make travel dangerous for both animals and people. The men had gone some distance from the wagons. The day was quiet, then it was not quiet. The Oglala Sioux war party that attacked the Kelly wagon train numbered perhaps 200 warriors. Estimates vary in different accounts, and the chaos of the next few minutes made precise observation difficult. They came at a gallop from the surrounding hills, and the speed and the noise of their approach, the horses, the war cries, the sudden overwhelming presence of something that had not been there a moment before, produced the particular paralysis. That extreme surprise inflicts on the human nervous system. There was shooting. There was fire. Several members of the party were killed in the first moments of the attack. Josiah Kelly survived and would eventually make his way to Fort Laramie, though the separation from his wife would last 5 months and carry its own particular anguish. Fanny and Mary and Josiah's niece, a girl named Fanny Wiggins, who was also a teenager, were taken. The wagons were looted and burned. In her book, Fanny describes the attack with the clarity of someone who has gone over the memory so many times that its details have become fixed with photographic precision. The color of the horses, the sounds, the specific moment when she understood that she was being taken rather than killed, the feel of being seized and placed on a horse and carried, away from the burning wreckage of everything she had brought west with her. Her writing in these passages has the quality of testimony, precise, controlled, the emotion present but held at a slight distance by the act of articulation, as if the only way to describe what had happened was to put a frame around it. She was 19 years old. She had been married for less than a year. She had never been more than a few hundred miles from the place where she was born, and now she was on a horse, moving at speed through the Wyoming hills, in the hands of people, whose language she did not speak and whose intentions she could not read, away from everything familiar. What she did in the first hours of her captivity is one of the most remarkable things about her. She observed. She was terrified. She says so directly, without false bravado. And she was terrified in a specific way. the terror of a person who does not know what is going to happen next and has no framework for making the prediction. But even inside that terror, she was watching. She was noting which warriors appeared to be in authority. She was listening to the language, picking out sounds and repetitions that might eventually become words she understood. She was calculating. She was trying to survive, and she understood instinctively, with the intelligence that extreme danger sometimes sharpens to a remarkable degree, that surviving required more than endurance. It required attention and judgment, and the discipline to act on judgment rather than panic. Mary, the 7-year-old girl who had no one but Fanny. In the chaos of the first night, Fanny managed to keep Mary with her, held the child close, spoke to her in the low, steady voice that terrified adults use for terrified children, tried to shield her from the worst of what was happening. But on the second day of the captivity, Fanny made a desperate decision. She wrote a note, scratched on a scrap of paper she had somehow kept through the attack, giving their location and direction of travel, and she tied the note to Mary and told her to slip away from the camp when the opportunity came and find soldiers and show them the note. Mary slipped away. She found a trail. She walked. She was found, days later, by a military scouting party. Found alive, found with the note, found in a condition that told the story of a 7-year-old child who had been alone in the Wyoming wilderness for days, surviving on what she could find, carrying the message that Fanny had given her. The soldiers read the note. They knew where Fanny was, or approximately where she was. They did not immediately find her. The information reached the forts and was acted on, but the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1864 was enormous, and the bands were moving constantly, and the gap between knowing approximately where someone was and being able to reach them was wide enough to contain weeks and months. Fanny did not know that Mary had survived. She would not know for months. She carried the not knowing through everything that followed, the uncertainty about whether the child she had sent into the wilderness alone had lived or died, whether the desperate gamble she had taken had been the right choice or a terrible one. She carried this with the same controlled steadiness she brought to everything, because there was nothing else to do with it. The not knowing was its own kind of captivity, running alongside the physical one, and in some ways harder to bear. The band that held Fanny Kelly was led by a chief called Ottawa, sometimes identified in historical sources as a man also known as Brings Plenty, one of the Oglala leaders who was operating in the Powder River country in the summer of 1864. The Oglala Sioux, as Fanny would come to understand over the months of her captivity, were not a simple enemy in the way that the captivity narrative, tradition of earlier American literature, tended to present native captors. They were a people, complex, internally diverse, possessed of their own politics and disputes and hierarchies, moving through a crisis of their own that in some ways mirrored and in some ways was caused by the crisis Fanny was experiencing. She was not treated with consistent cruelty. This needs to be said clearly because it runs against the captivity narrative tradition that her own book was partly shaped by, the tradition of the savage captor and the helpless white victim that 19th century publishers expected, and that Fanny, writing for that audience, partly accommodated. The reality she actually describes, between the lines of the expected framing, is more complicated. There were warriors who treated her brutally. There were also women in the camp who showed her small, consistent kindnesses. Food when she was hungry, extra robes when she was cold, the particular solidarity that women sometimes offer to other women in circumstances that are beyond either party's control. She learned to observe the camp's social structure. She identified the women with authority, the wives of chiefs and headmen who had real influence over daily life in ways that the warrior's hierarchy did not entirely capture. She learned which men were volatile and which were measured. She learned the rhythms of the camp, when decisions were being made, when the mood was dangerous, when there was room for the small acts of agency that could make the difference between surviving and not surviving. She began to learn the language. Not fluently. 5 months was not enough for fluency, and the circumstances were not those of a classroom, but enough. Enough to catch the drift of conversations, enough to understand when she was being discussed and approximately what was being said. enough to identify names and relationships and the specific words that indicated danger or opportunity. She did this quietly, without advertising what she understood, storing the language away with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. This was not a passive act. Learning the language of the people who held her was an act of resistance as much as adaptation, a refusal to remain entirely in the dark about her own situation, a determination to be as informed as possible about what was happening around her, so that when opportunities came, she would be positioned to act on them. She also wrote. She had managed to keep a pencil and some paper through the attack and its immediate aftermath, and in the private hours of captivity, she wrote not the book she would eventually publish, but the notes and observations and records that would become its raw material. She described what she saw. She described the landscape, the movement of the band, the weather, the specific incidents that marked each day. She wrote the names she learned, the words she picked up, the conversations she overheard. She was doing what writers do, converting experience into language as a way of processing it, as a way of not being entirely consumed by it. She hid these writings. She was aware that if they were found and understood, the response from some members of the band would be dangerous. She hid them in the small spaces available to her, the lining of her clothing, the underside of a robe. She continued to write. This was, in its way, as brave as anything else she did. The band moved constantly through the summer and into the fall, following the patterns of plains nomadic life, the buffalo hunts, the moves to new camping grounds, the political visits. Between bands that constituted the social fabric of Lakota life, Fanny traveled with them, on horseback when the group traveled fast, on foot when circumstances required it. She describes the landscape of the Powder River country with the specificity of someone who crossed it many times in many conditions. The wide valleys, the sage-covered hills, the dramatic breaks where the land dropped suddenly into creek bottoms lined with cottonwoods going gold in the autumn. She was also, throughout this period, sending messages. This is one of the aspects of her captivity that most dramatically distinguishes her from the passive victim of the captivity narrative tradition. Whenever she had contact with other travelers, with men from other bands who might have connections to the forts, with mixed-blood traders who moved between the Sioux world and the American military world, she tried to get messages out. She wrote notes. She communicated verbally when she could. She told anyone who might be able to help where she was and who held her and that she was alive. Some of these messages got through. The army was aware that she was alive and approximately where she was from relatively early in her captivity. The problem was not information. It was the complex military and political situation that made a simple rescue operation impossible. The band that held her was not at war in any formal sense. Going into the Powder River country with a military force to demand her release might trigger the kind of conflict that the army, already stretched by the Civil War, was trying to avoid. She understood this, in outline, if not in detail. She understood that she was a pawn in something larger than her own situation, that her captivity had diplomatic dimensions that went beyond the personal, that what happened to her was entangled with the broader question of relations between the United States and the Sioux in ways that made simple solutions impossible. This understanding did not make her situation more comfortable, but it gave her a framework for making sense of why nothing was happening, which was better than the alternative of believing she had simply been forgotten. One of the most remarkable and least discussed aspects of Fanny Kelly's captivity is the degree to which she functioned as an informal diplomatic intermediary between her captors and the United States military. This was not a role anyone assigned her. It was a role she created for herself, out of the intersection of her situation and her intelligence, and her understanding that being useful was the best available strategy for survival. The Sioux bands of the Powder River country in 1864 were in constant, complex negotiation with the American military presence in the region, the forts along the trail, the soldiers who patrolled the emigrant routes, the government agents who moved between the military and the native communities trying to prevent the kind of full-scale war that was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. These negotiations were conducted in bad faith on multiple sides, through interpreters whose accuracy was variable and whose loyalties were often unclear. The result was a persistent state of misunderstanding that served nobody's actual interests and was moving steadily toward catastrophe. Fanny, who was learning the Lakota language and who was already fluent in English, found herself in a position to provide something genuinely valuable: communication that was not filtered through the distortions of official channels. When messages came from the forts asking about her condition and offering terms for her release, she was sometimes allowed to respond, because her captors found her useful too as a potential diplomatic asset, as a demonstration of the band's willingness to negotiate, as a possible source of information about American military intentions. She used these opportunities carefully. She confirmed she was alive. She described her location as accurately as she could. She communicated information about the band's intentions and movements when she believed doing so might prevent violence. She navigated the line between providing enough information to maintain the communication and providing so much that she endangered herself or the people in the camp whose relative kindness she depended on. This required a level of political sophistication that is extraordinary in any person and almost unimaginable in a 19-year-old woman in her first year of marriage, 5 months into a captivity that had begun with the burning of her wagon and the deaths of members of her party. She was not trained for this. She had no precedent to draw on. She was reasoning in real time, in a situation that had no established protocols, with stakes that included her own life. She did it well. The communications she managed to send were accurate and useful. The information she provided helped the Army understand the situation in the Powder River country at a moment when that understanding was genuinely important. And she did it without compromising the safety of the people in the camp in ways that would have made her position untenable, because she understood, with the practical intelligence that characterized everything she did, that her survival depended on maintaining the trust, or at least the tolerance, of the people who held her. There is a specific incident that illustrates this balancing act with particular clarity. At some point during her captivity, the exact timing is difficult to establish from her account, she learned that the band was planning a raid on a military installation or a wagon train. She was not certain of the target or the timing, but she was certain of the general intention. She needed to warn the army. She also needed to not be discovered warning the army, because discovery would mean death. She wrote a note. She found a way to get it to a mixed-blood trader who was passing through the camp and who she believed had connections to the forts. She conveyed the warning in terms that were specific enough to be useful and vague enough to be deniable. If the note were intercepted and she were questioned about it, the note got through. Whether the specific raid she warned about was prevented or modified as a result is not documented with certainty in the historical record, but the message was received and acted upon. She had warned the potential victims of an attack while living in the camp of the attackers, using a communication channel she had built herself out of observation and patience and the willingness to take a calculated risk. She had done this not because anyone asked her to, not because it served her immediate survival, it was in some ways contrary to it, but because there were people who were going to die and she could do something about it, and she believed, at a level below political calculation, that doing something about it was simply what you did when you could. This is the Fanny Kelly that the captivity narrative genre of her era could not quite contain. The genre expected a woman who endured. She was a woman who acted. One of the most significant and most surprising aspects of Fanny Kelly's account is what she says about the Sioux women she lived among during her captivity. The captivity narrative tradition of her era and the expectations of her 19th century readers pushed toward a portrait of her captors as uniformly threatening, uniformly other, uniformly defined by their opposition to everything she represented. The actual account she gives, when you read it carefully, is considerably more nuanced than that. She describes women who fed her when she was hungry, without being asked, and without any apparent motive beyond the recognition that she was hungry and they had food. She describes women who showed her how to do the work that was required of her in the camp, the preparation of hides, the carrying of water, the cooking over open fires, with a patience that she acknowledges must have been somewhat irritating, given how poorly she did it at first. She describes a woman who gave her an extra robe on a cold night, whose name she learned and recorded. whose face she describes with the specificity of someone who has sat across from it in firelight and paid attention. She also describes women who were cruel to her, or indifferent, or who made her situation harder than it needed to be. She is honest about this. She does not romanticize the camp or the relationships within it, but she also does not reduce the women she encountered to a single dimension, because she was too good an observer and too honest a writer to do that, even within the constraints of the genre she was writing in. What she was living inside, she came to understand, was a world with its own complete interior, its own politics and its own kindnesses and its own cruelties, its own hierarchy of authority and its own exceptions to that hierarchy, its own humor and its own grief. The band was living through its own crisis, the pressure from the army, the shrinking of the buffalo ranges, the awareness that the world they had always known was being changed faster than they could adapt to the changes, and the women of the camp carried that crisis in their bodies and their daily work the way women always carry the weight of the worlds they live in. Fanny could not fully enter that world. The language barrier was too great, the cultural distance too wide, the circumstances too constrained. But she stood at its edge and looked in with the attention of someone who understood that what she was seeing was real and complex and worth the effort of understanding. This is, in itself, a kind of moral achievement, the willingness in the middle of one's own suffering to see the full humanity of the people responsible for that suffering. She did not always achieve it. There are passages in her book where the framework of her era's racism and its assumptions about savagery overwhelmed the more honest observations she was capable of. She was not exempt from the attitudes of her time and her culture, but she strained against those attitudes more than most writers of her era and her genre, and the straining is visible on the page for readers who are looking for it. There was a woman in the camp whose name Fanny renders in her book as brings water, though the transliteration may be approximate. This woman appears several times in Fanny's account, always in the context of small, specific acts of help. A piece of food, a warning conveyed with a gesture when one of the warriors was in a dangerous mood, a moment of wordless sympathy. On a night when Fanny was visibly struggling, she is never named as a friend. The word friend is not available across the gap between their situations, but she is named, and she is seen, and she is remembered with a specificity that distinguishes her from the anonymity in which most of Fanny's captors appear. Fanny carried the memory of Bring's water for the rest of her life. She wrote about her in the book with a care that suggests the memory mattered, that across the distance of years and culture and the complete transformation of everything that had surrounded them both in 1864, the specific woman who had offered food on a cold night in the Powder River country remained present to her, remained real, remained a person rather than a type. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the larger things in Fanny Kelly's story. The maintenance of specific, human recognition across every boundary that the situation erected to prevent it. In September of 1864, Fanny Kelly was transferred. The band that had captured her sold her. This is the word used in the historical accounts, and it reflects the reality of the transaction even as it flattens its complexity. To a Blackfeet Sioux chief named Two Bears. The Blackfeet Sioux were a different band from the Oglala who had taken her, and the transfer meant a new camp, a new set of people, a new set of relationships to build and navigate, a new language variant to decipher. She had spent 2 months building the minimal but genuine understanding of her situation that she had achieved with the Oglala band. She had learned which people could be trusted and which could not, had identified the rhythms and the danger points, had established the rudiments of communication that made her survival possible. The transfer meant beginning again. She began. Again. Two Bears was a more complex figure in her account than Ottawa had been. He was a man of genuine political sophistication, aware that the captive white woman he held was a diplomatic asset of some value, aware that how he treated her would affect his relationships with the army, aware that the situation with the United States was deteriorating in ways that made those relationships increasingly consequential. He treated Fanny with a rough consideration that she distinguishes carefully from kindness. He was not kind exactly, but he was not gratuitously cruel, and the distinction mattered. His wife was a different matter, the wife of Two Bears. whose name Fanny does not record with certainty, was hostile to Fanny's presence with a consistency that went beyond the political and into the personal. She was the one who assigned the hardest work, who withheld food when she could, who made the daily texture of Fanny's existence as difficult as she was able within the constraints that Two Bears' interest in maintaining Fanny's value as a diplomatic asset imposed. Fanny navigated this hostility with the same steady, calibrated attention she brought to everything, never provoking, never fully submitting, finding the small spaces of agency that existed even inside this compressed situation. She was also, during this period, increasingly ill. The cumulative effect of months of inadequate nutrition, physical hardship, exposure, and sustained psychological stress was taking its toll on a body that had been healthy and strong, but had limits. She ran fevers. She describes episodes of weakness that frightened her. Not the fear of death exactly, but the fear of becoming unable to function, unable to think clearly, unable to maintain the active intelligence that was her primary means of survival. She recovered from each episode with the stubbornness that seemed to be her body's dominant characteristic, and she returned to the work of surviving as soon as she was able. The negotiations for her release were conducted by Fort Sully, one of the Army forts on the Missouri River, through a series of intermediaries whose reliability varied and whose communications were slow and imprecise. The Army wanted Fanny returned. Two Bears wanted something in exchange: horses, trade, goods, the kind of material compensation that would justify to his band the loss of a captive who had been acquired at considerable cost. The negotiations proceeded with the grinding slowness of all negotiations conducted across cultural gaps through unreliable translators, with both sides uncertain about the other's actual intentions and neither side in a position to make binding commitments without lengthy consultations. Fanny watched these negotiations from the inside, using her slowly accumulating grasp of the Sioux language to follow what she could of the conversations. She sent what information she could through the channels she had been building. She waited with the active patience that was her particular gift. Not the passive patience of someone who has given up on agency, but the patience of someone who has done everything she can do and is now waiting for the results while remaining ready to act the moment a new opportunity appears. The opportunity came in December of 1864. The negotiations concluded in early December 1864. The specific terms involved a payment of horses and goods. The details are recorded in Army correspondence from Fort Sully that survives in the historical record. Two Bears agreed to release Fanny, and a delegation from the fort came to receive her. She had been in captivity for approximately 5 months. She was 20 years old. She had crossed the Wyoming and Dakota territories on horseback and on foot, in summer heat and autumn cold, and the beginning of a northern plains winter. She had lost Mary and did not know if Mary lived. She had watched members of her wagon party killed. She had been separated from her husband for 5 months. She had been ill. She had been cold and hungry and frightened. She had also observed and written and communicated and negotiated and warned and survived with an intelligence and a courage that would not be fully recognized in her own lifetime. That would be partly obscured by the conventions of the genre in which she eventually told her story, that has been recognized only gradually by historians who have gone back to the primary sources and read between the lines of the expected narrative. When she arrived at Fort Sully, she learned that Mary was alive. The child she had sent alone into the Wyoming wilderness in the second day of her captivity had survived. The scouting party had found her. She had been taken to the fort and cared for. She was waiting. We do not have a detailed account of the reunion between Fanny Kelly and Mary Hurley. It is one of the places where the historical record is sparse, and the imagination is invited to fill in what documents cannot provide. What we know is that both of them survived, and that they found each other, and that the gamble Fanny had taken, the terrible, desperate gamble of sending a 7-year-old child alone into the wilderness with a note, had been the right choice. The rightness of it did not come cheaply. Fanny had purchased it with 5 months of not knowing, 5 months of carrying the weight of a decision she could not undo, 5 months of not knowing if she had sent the child to safety or to death. The rightness, when it arrived, was real and complete. but it was surrounded by everything that had been required to reach it. The reunion with Josiah Kelly was complicated in ways that the captivity narrative genre of the era did not fully address, and that subsequent historians have been more willing to examine. Josiah had spent the 5 months of Fanny's captivity in a combination of genuine grief and what appears to have been a certain amount of practical self-preservation. He had survived the attack and made his way to the fort and had been working within the system to try to secure his wife's release. But 5 months is a long time, and the person who returned from captivity was not quite the same person who had been taken, and the marriage that resumed at Fort Sully in December 1864 was not quite the same marriage that had set off from Kansas in May. They stayed together. They eventually made their way to Idaho, the destination that had been their original intention, and then back east, and Josiah died in 1867, 3 years after the events on the Little Box Elder Creek, leaving Fanny a widow at 22, with a daughter born during the Idaho years named Fanny Wiggins Kelly after herself. The early death of Josiah, and what it meant for Fanny's life and for the writing of her book, is part of the story that follows. Fanny Kelly began working on her account of the captivity almost immediately after her return. This is not surprising. She had been writing throughout the captivity itself, storing up the material in her hidden notes and her extraordinary memory, and the impulse to shape it into a coherent narrative was both personal and practical. Personal because writing was how she processed experience, how she made meaning of what had happened, how she maintained the integrity of the self that the captivity had subjected to enormous pressure. Practical because the captivity narrative was an established and commercially viable literary genre in America, and a woman who had survived what she had survived could reasonably expect that the public would want to read about it. The book She, eventually published in 1871, 7 years after the events it described, is a complicated document. It is shaped by the conventions of its genre in ways that sometimes obscure the more interesting reality underneath. The 19th century captivity narrative expected certain things: the horror of the capture, the suffering of the captive, the otherness of the captors, the divine providence that sustained the captive through the ordeal and ultimately delivered her to safety. Fanny gives the reader these things because the reader expected them, and because the publisher expected them, and because they were in some degree true. But she also gives the reader more than these things: the specific details of the camp life, the specific names and faces of the people she encountered, the specific incidents of negotiation and communication and warning and survival that constituted the actual texture of her 5 months. These are present in the book in a way that strains against the genre's expectations. A reader who comes to the book expecting simple melodrama will find it in the places where Fanny provided it. A reader who comes looking for the actual story of an intelligent woman navigating an impossible situation with extraordinary resources will also find it in the places where the actual story breaks through. The book was a bestseller. It went through multiple editions. It was read across the country and in England. It made Fanny Kelly briefly one of the most famous women in America, not for her courage or her intelligence, which the genre's conventions made difficult to fully articulate, but for her suffering, which the conventions handled expertly. She was celebrated as a victim. She had been something considerably more interesting. She spent years fighting for accurate recognition of her experiences and her contributions. The most significant of these fights was over her claim that she had provided intelligence to the army during her captivity, the notes and warnings and communications she had sent from inside the camp. The army, which had received and used this intelligence, was slow to formally acknowledge it. This mattered not only for Fanny's historical reputation, but for a more practical reason. She was petitioning Congress for compensation, as many frontier women who had suffered captivity did, and the acknowledgement of her active service to the army would have supported the claim. Congress eventually passed a bill awarding her compensation, $5,000, approved in 1868, before the book was even published. This was real money in 1868, and it represented an acknowledgement, however partial and delayed, of what she had done. But the process of getting it had required years of documentation and advocacy and the navigation of bureaucratic indifference. That was its own particular kind of ordeal. Fanny Kelly's life after the book is not as well documented as her life during and immediately after the captivity, which is a common pattern for women whose historical fame rests on a single extraordinary event. The event gets documented. The decades of ordinary and less than ordinary life that follow get less attention. But what is documented suggests a woman who continued to be interesting and capable and restless in ways that went beyond the single chapter for which she is remembered. After Josiah's death in 1867, she was a widow at 22 with a small child, and a story that was in the process of becoming famous. She spent several years navigating the practical difficulties of widowhood in the frontier West, the economic challenges, the social limitations, the question of what a young woman with a child and no husband did next in a world that offered women limited options. She worked. She advocated for herself. She pursued the congressional compensation claim with the tenacity that characterized everything she did. She married a second time, in 1880, to a man named John Fitzgerald Howard. Not the John Fitzgerald who had figured in Hugh Glass's story, a coincidence of history that is almost too neat. John Howard was a farmer and rancher in the Dakota Territory, and the marriage was apparently stable in ways that Fanny's first marriage, with its extraordinary interruption, had not had the opportunity to be. They settled in Dakota Territory, in the landscape that Fanny had crossed as a captive 16 years earlier, and made a life there. She continued to be involved in public life in ways that were unusual for women of her era. She gave lectures. She participated in veterans and frontier history organizations. She corresponded with historians and writers who were documenting the era she had lived through. She was, in the language of a later time, an advocate for her own story and for the accurate telling of it. A woman who understood that stories are not just records of what happened, but arguments about what it meant, and who was not willing to leave the argument entirely to others. She outlived the world she had written about. By the time she died in 1904, the Oregon Trail was a memory. The Sioux Wars were 30 years past. The frontier that had defined her most vivid experiences had been absorbed into a settled, managed landscape of farms and railroads and small towns. The Wyoming and Dakota territories she had crossed as a 19-year-old captive were states now, with courthouses and newspapers and elected officials and all the apparatus of American civic life. She was 59 years old when she died. She had been a captive and a widow and an author and a petitioner and a lecturer and a rancher's wife and a mother. She had been many things, in a life that the single famous chapter of it tends to obscure. She had been the woman on the Little Box Elder Creek in July 1864, watching her world burn, and she had also been every other woman she had been in the 40 years that followed. Mary Hurley. The girl survives the story too, as far as the historical record shows. She grew up, as children grow up, away from the event that had marked her at 7 years old. The days alone in the Wyoming wilderness, the military scouting party that found her, the fort, the reunion. She is not a major figure in the historical record. She was not famous. She was a woman who had survived something extraordinary as a child and who then lived her life, which is the most ordinary and the most important thing a person can do. Fanny Kelly kept track of her. The relationship between them, not quite a mother and daughter, not quite former guardian and child, something that defied the available categories in the same way that much of Fanny's experience defied available categories, persisted in some form. The specific details are not fully documented, but the care that Fanny had shown for Mary in the second day of her captivity, the care that had expressed itself in a desperate gamble that turned out to be right, was not a one-time thing. It was who she was. The Little Box Elder Creek still flows through Converse County, Wyoming, into the North Platte River as it flowed in July of 1864. The land around it has changed. There are fences and roads and the various marks of a settled agricultural landscape, but the creek is the same creek, and the hills above it are the same hills, and the sky above those hills is the same enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky. Nobody put a marker there to commemorate what happened on that stretch of trail in July 1864. This is not unusual. The Oregon Trail is full of places where extraordinary things happened to ordinary people who were trying to get somewhere and found that getting there required more than they had planned for. Most of those places are unmarked. Most of those people are remembered, if at all, by descendants who carry the story the way all families carry stories, imperfectly, in fragments, the details shifting over time into something that is partly memory and partly legend and partly the need of each generation to make the past into something that makes sense to them. Fanny Kelly left a book. It is still in print. A reader who picks it up today will find a narrative shaped by the expectations of its era and its genre. And beneath those expectations will find the actual woman. The woman who observed and wrote and warned and negotiated and survived. The woman who sent a 7-year-old child alone into the wilderness because it was the right thing to do. The woman who learned the language of the people who held her and used it to protect people who would otherwise have been hurt. The woman who went back into the memory of all of it for 7 years and made it into something a reader could hold. She was not a professional soldier or a famous chief or a legendary explorer. She was a 19-year-old woman from Ontario who was trying to get to Idaho and found herself in the middle of something she had not chosen and could not escape, and she handled it with a combination of courage and intelligence and moral seriousness that most people in most situations never have to call upon, and that she called upon every day for 5 months. She handled it without training, without precedent, without the support of any institution or authority. She handled it with what she had, an observant mind, a disciplined pen, a capacity for genuine attention to the people around her, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided, somewhere below the level of conscious decision-making, that she is not going to be broken by this. She was not broken by it. She was changed by it. How could she not be? But she was not broken. She came out of the Powder River country in December of 1864 with her mind intact, her self intact, her care for Mary intact, her capacity for writing intact. She came out with notes hidden in her clothing and a story in her head that she would spend 7 years shaping into a book that people are still reading 150 years later. That is not nothing. For a woman of her era, in her circumstances, it is very nearly everything. The Oregon Trail is quiet now. The grass has grown back over the ruts. The creek runs on. The hills above it are the same color as they were in July of 1864 when everything changed. The tan and sage green of the Wyoming summer. The rock showing through where the hills are steep. The cottonwoods in the creek bottom moving in whatever. Wind is moving tonight. Fanny Kelly crossed this country. She crossed it as a captive. And she crossed it in her memory for the rest of her life. And she crossed it again every time someone opened her book and read the first page. She is in this landscape the way people are in landscapes that shape them. Not visibly, not monumentally, but present, the way water is present in the earth even when there is no river showing. She observed everything. She forgot nothing. She wrote it down. You are nearly asleep. The words are becoming soft now. The images dissolving into the general warmth of the dark. The story settling into you the way a long story settles when you have been listening with your whole body. The little box. Elder Creek is very far away. The Oregon Trail is very far away. The Wyoming hills and the Powder River country and the campfires and the hidden notes and the gray December morning when she came back and found out Mary was alive. All of it very far away and very present, the way the things that have shaped us are always both. She was not broken. You are not broken. The creek runs on. Sleep now. You have earned it. Sleep. Thank you for visiting the Monotone Museum. If tonight's story brought you calm, consider subscribing to help preserve the next one. The archive is always open. Rest well.